So on this panel, I'd like to introduce Aedin Culhane from the University of Limerick, who we've met before. I'd like to introduce Josh Greenberg from the Alfred Sloan Foundation. I'd like to introduce Angela Newell from the University of Texas. Welcome. And who else have we got? We've got Brian Fitzgerald. Hiya, Brian. Stalwart, remember you last year. And of course, the inestimable Clare Dillon, our glorious leader. So over to her.
Thanks, Oisin. I think we may have to share some mics. We don't have enough to go around, so we'll collaborate that way. That's what we're all about. So I suppose I want to start by just asking this panel their own perspective of open source as it relates to open research. And maybe I'll start from the end with you, Angela, just to give us an overview about your role and your, I suppose your point of view about this particular topic.
I'm Angela Newell. I'm from the University of Texas at Austin. I direct the open source program office there at the university. My perspective on open source and open research is that as a university, particularly one in the public interest, who serves the public interest, it is our job to share knowledge with the world. So open research is how we do that. Open source software helps us communicate the methods with which our research is conducted, helps us display our research products, and helps us communicate our research story. So these things are inextricably linked. We are hopeful as researchers sometimes that we might produce something that is useful in the world in a general context, and if a software were useful, something like Red Hat that was produced in the UC system, or Zenodo that was produced here by someone on this panel, Zotero, sorry, that I make all my students use. Right, sorry. But we're also hopeful that we do produce some products that the world will find useful that are not research. But the connection between open source and open research is varied and varied.
Thank you, Angela. Aedin, do you want to build on that?
Most research is taxpayer funded.
Most research is taxpayer funded or funded by philanthropy donations. And I think we have a duty of care to make sure that our work can be leveraged by others. All research, we are building on the shoulders of giants, and open software allows us to do that so that our research has impact. I think if we, I think I just talked to my talk earlier, we're on the governance board of Bioconductor, which is open source software for life sciences. And I think the importance of that is demonstrated by the citations and the mentions in papers. Like 4 of the top 10 open source softwares are in our product Bioconductor. And so making tools available to analyze the data is really important for leveraging the most out of the funding that we get. But I think the second thing is trust. The public need to trust that their money is being spent wisely. If they see people like duplicating effort, that's a waste of funds. If they see people doing work that then can't be reproduced, isn't accessible, isn't inoperable, isn't reproducible or reusable, it's a waste of money. So I think it's just a duty of care. We have to do it.
Thank you, Aedin. Josh?
Hi, I'm Josh Greenberg. I work at a private philanthropic foundation in the United States. The way I think about the relationship between open source and open research is that open research contains multitudes. It contains a lot of different things, and there are a lot of different aspects of research. In my work over the past 15 years, we spent a lot of time thinking about scholarly communication. And if you start by thinking about open access to the literature, you start with a conversation around intellectual property and publishers and ownership. if you are, we spend a lot of time thinking about data curation and data science. If you start with open data, the first things that come up are often privacy or, data sovereignty. When you start with open source, and that's actually where we've organized a lot of our work around these days, when you start with open source, the first things that come up are actually about collaboration, about working across boundaries, around governance. These are things that are really core to open source. There's a lot for the research world to learn from the broader open source ecosystem. And so because we really want to sort of foreground, picking up from the last panel, these questions of how research is this massively distributed enterprise where everyone's standing on everybody else's shoulders and ideally working together in a direction. That's where sort of, there's a lot for the broader open research community to learn from open source.
Thanks, Josh. And Brian, do you want to give your...
My name is Brian Fitzgerald. I'm a professor at the University of Limerick and was director of Lero at Ireland's National Software Research Centre. So I've been interested in open source software since 1998, since the term was coined. And I think what surprised me then was the paradox. Could this really work? I'd been in the software industry for 12 years and we could never write good software, let alone for free. But I think the main thing open source, we wouldn't be here today without open source software, and there wouldn't be initiatives like open science, open access, open innovation, open standards, open governance, open health, you name it. They're all only exist really as they do because of the proof that open source as a proof of concept that it worked. And research wouldn't happen. So we take for granted, for example, you talked about Bioconductor, Aedin, or Python, Jupyter notebooks, Overleaf. If they didn't exist, research would stop. So it's like when I was growing up, there was an ad by Dunlop's rubber company, and they show the world without Dunlop's rubber. Basically, there were no tires in cars, there were no tennis balls, there was no moving walkways. It was all part of our life. And if you took away open source, life would cease. Modern life depends on open source, and research is no different.
So thank you for those perspectives. And I think there is loads of stuff and literature out there and evidence about the importance of open source in the context of open research. But let's try and get a little bit maybe deeper into kind of some of the practical things that make it work, because I think this panel has a lot of experience in terms of what that might look like. Now, when in some of our panel prep sessions, we talked about what's happening today, what may be happening in the future. But let's talk about today as it stands right now in terms of, before we go into the future of where it's all going, what do we think are best practices today about making open source work for the context of open research, and what is happening in the landscape in terms of like best practices, I suppose? Do you want to start, Angela?
I should have sat on the other end of this panel.
We'll mix it up next time, I promise.
Okay, so I'm going to keep in mind that I have people here who are interested in industry and people who are interested in academia and people who are interested in the public sector. And here's what I'm going to say. Probably the number one best practice that anyone who's working in open source can do is work to make their work reproducible. So really good documentation, really good versioning, really good explanations of this is the goal of my product, these are the components of my product, and this is kind of what I expected it to do, with the understanding that someone is going to come in and potentially contribute to that product, or fork that product and take it somewhere new. So if you start with that end goal in mind, that you're going to build something that although it achieves a purpose in your lab, it will eventually go out and hit the street. And as my colleague Jen says, someone will use it in frustration or anger because they can't get whatever they're doing to work. And so they think they'll borrow your great thing. I think that's probably the biggest thing I could impart for any of those audiences. And I would say one of the points of collaboration then across those audiences is an open source software product that is transferable, reproducible, because someone has employed best practices.
Thank you, Angela. Josh, I'll bring you in.
Yeah, I'd like to sort of yes and that, because I think absolutely because of the broader research mission and the ideals, you want your stuff to go out and be used elsewhere. The research world is also kind of weird because built into the successful operation of a research lab is the presumption that most of your staff is going to leave and is going to do elsewhere, or is going to go elsewhere. If you are a head of a lab, you have students, you have postdocs. Your job is to train them up and they will become your collaborators someday. They will probably not work in the same institution or in the same lab. And so if you are building up infrastructure, if you're building up tooling, you want that to be portable as well. And you want those people to be able to continue to engage in and contribute to and feel a stake in that infrastructure. Otherwise, they have to go start from scratch, and that's just like not nearly as effective for science. So it's not just about other people out there, but also the people you have working with you being able to remain parts of the project. And the last thing I'll just say is one of, I think, the deepest felt fears of anybody who runs a computational research lab of any sort is that the one person who actually knows how a particular code base works leaves. And the best hedge against that is to actually run it like a healthy open source project, where even if your bus factor is 1 because you've got one person who knows it, you've got the documentation, you've got governance, you've got other things in place so that it can be more resilient.
Thanks, Josh. Brian, did you want to come in?
But just on that, I think as a research centre, we had an awful lot of open source software being produced, but we had no systematic approach to it. Our reviewers told us at one point, you're doing all this research and you're producing this software, but you're not doing as well as you could. So we had no guidelines, for example, and we talked to the researchers creating software. They didn't know much about licensing, for example. If you've no licensing, legal option to reuse. So we trained them on licensing, on good first issues, on sustainability, how to create a community-friendly atmosphere, how to ensure the software could survive afterwards. Like there's a ton of EU projects, for example, in the past they'd say, well, it's all going to be made available open source. That has really no effect if you haven't got a community that's willing that understands it and can contribute. It's just the same as closed source software. No one will ever use it. So getting that kind of community involvement, and several people have talked about it in the previous sessions as well, the idea that you can't take that for granted. You have to do that. And there's best practices that you can use to do that. And we need to do that.
Thanks, Brian. And I just want to add to that because an interesting stat that we heard in the last 2 days when we had the academic community here, we had folks from Software Heritage, and I believe Bastien is here today as well. But they did, France has been investing in open research and open source software enablement for years. And they did a report into the software projects in French universities, and they were looking to see what licenses were attached. And 70% of the open source projects didn't have any license attached, which of course means that they're not open source. And so when we are talking about those best practices, it is so critical. People talk about this stuff, even if they feel that they've made it reproducible. If they don't understand the intricacies of doing that, then I think, we're just not doing it as well as we could. And we're putting friction in the system for reuse and all those sorts of things that are beyond even the code and the documentation. And I suppose, though, to build on that, because we've been talking here about what individuals could do, or what even labs might want to think about doing in the context of their, how they work. I suppose one of the things I didn't mention earlier is that with another hat on, I run a community called the Community for University and Research Institution, OSPOs, and we're about the open source program offices in academia that help things at an institutional level. And I think that that's a challenge in itself. And I want to come to you, Aedin, to think about, apart from at an individual level and at a kind of a lab level, what do you think that could be done at an either institutional level or bigger that could support this effort? Because it's not just about individuals doing it for themselves.
So I think it's in the US and in Europe. Universities value citations and field-weighted citation impact and impactful publications. It is the weight in which they work. If you have software that is findable, that's usable, that will be reused, you will have higher impact on your publication. And so I think that has to be, you have to attract with a carrot, And so that I think is one of the biggest carrots for universities is saying, you know what, we'll go up in university rankings if we do it this way because our software is going to be used more and it will be cited more. Now, there's caveats to that because sometimes software is used and just mentioned and not cited, you know, but and how do we properly then, you know, incentivize the developers and things. But we do know that software that's well written, that's documented, as you mentioned, that's findable, that's licensed, that can be reused, is more likely to be cited.
Thanks, Aedin. And Josh?
Yeah, if I can add to that, because I think there's the near term, here's something that I think is maybe like happening in like green shoots, but isn't like fully widespread yet, which is actually legitimizing software as a first order research product of its own. You can have a paper that references a GitHub repo, and then, you know, you can like maybe pull that out of you know, OpenAlex or Google Scholar or somewhere like that. But there are efforts like the Journal of Open Source Software that are trying to actually establish what does a software native review process look like. And the people like those working in OSPOs and universities who are trying to do the policy work internally to legitimize that. I think in the French context, we've seen national efforts to really make visible what is the scope of work and to start valuing it in funding calls, valuing it in individual hiring decisions and in institutional evaluation. So that's the near term area where there needs to be more work done. And I think those who embrace that earlier on are going to end up being further out ahead.
Thanks, Josh. And I suppose I want to come actually to you, Angela, because I love the whole talk about system enablement and the idea that we would change the incentive structures and everything like that. But I also want, for those people who are not familiar with the focus from an infrastructure perspective and even the whole trend of research software engineering as being a new thing in universities, can you maybe comment about what that looks like today in terms of, you know, the whole area of a university or a research institution providing these things as services as opposed to necessarily, again, everyone figuring it out for themselves?
So I think the first thing to remember when you're dealing with universities, OSPOs, and research is that researchers are researchers by training. They are not computational specialists necessarily or software developers by training. So if you're coming at this from a service perspective, like I think most OSPOs hit it from a service perspective, you have to take that approach. This person that's coming to you, that you're talking to, maybe a world-renowned expert, but they need your help to develop that expertise in a way that they can execute in a software package. So that's the first thing. And if you're an industry partner and you're coming in, I think shared honored expertise is something that that is very valuable. I am an academic by training, and I can tell you when I walk into a room, there is sometimes an air of, you know, that's an academic and there's a certain feeling you have about that, and you place it as like that person thinks they're an expert and knows everything. And I will tell you that most academics walk into the room and are like, I'm stupid at everything but this one thing that I do really well. So we really appreciate the interaction with industry or with the public sector that kind of says, hey, we can help you with that. So I think that's a service that an OSPO can provide, that connection, but also the ability to really work on a software project in a way where we're imparting good software development skills to somebody who's really good at something else as a primary. So that's the number one thing. When it comes to RSEs, research software engineers, the same is true. A lot of them come from a discipline perspective and have to remember, one, research projects are short-lived. Typically, it's rare to get a long-lived one. So setting out and imparting a set of good research or software development skills is really important. Understanding that if you come into a space where research software engineers are available, that being able to be general as well as being able to understand that discipline is very important. Right now in the academic infrastructure, software development and software engineer is not necessarily understood as something that is, and Aedin can talk more about this, a job classification. We call our research software engineer research associates. They're just someone who's part of the research team. So there's not a career path. There's not a space for these people to go. So this is another really good spot for engagement of multiple sectors, is really letting academia borrow from sort of the industry infrastructure. Actually, I'm going to pass it off to Nadine now because you have some really good commentary on research software engineers. But the space to say is there is an emerging large space for research software engineers as an understood engineering class in research, and we should probably think about that.
Thank you. I think definitely in Ireland there isn't the concept of research software engineer. The idea of staff scientists who actually manage core facilities is underdeveloped. But if we think of kind of research software engineers as kind of those people managing the core facility, and the core facility is your data center, and that's really expensive to run. And if you put crap software up on that, or, that's expensive. It's expensive in terms of power. It's expensive in terms of water. It's expensive in terms of climate. It costs. And so there needs to be a step there between, people developing innovative algorithms that can actually, unlock new potential in that data, to actually the people who don't do the software optimization. And quite often those skills are not in the same person, because the people who are thinking of new algorithms don't necessarily do the optimization side of things. And I think those two communities need to come together. In a lot of cases, the people who are doing the software optimization for the GPU, that should be provided as a core facility in a lot of cases.
Thank you. And thank you for bringing us, because I want to switch tack now, because I kind of feel like in all our conversations in the last few days and today as well, there is a kind of a pull towards, and the world is not as we know it, or, the world of the past is gone. So I do want to kind of bring us to where we're going. And your comment reminded me in the last few days when we were talking in that academic context, someone brought up the idea of having a software developer in a corporate institution or a corporate organization, where they were saying that, they were concerned about the amount of tokens they were using. And then there was like, what's the cost, a loaded cost of a developer, like a good software developer is their, salary, and then how much generative AI they might use in a year. And now we're starting to multiply the cost of a developer just by their use. So the financial impact of doing software development is now bigger. And I suppose, so thinking about everything that's coming at us and thinking about like where we're going around AI generated code, and we've heard the ideas of AI slop, and this is all, but also where AI could be useful in the context of enabling open source in open research. Can I maybe ask the panel, what are your thoughts about that? Like, and bearing in mind, back to whoever, Angela, you were saying, like, none of us, I think, know the answer, but what are you feeling are the signals we should be looking for, or your points of view on that? We'll start with you.
Okay, thank you. So you might think academic researchers are intelligent people. I think there's good evidence to show they're not. So we write papers for free. We review those papers for free. We edit journals for free, and then we pay for access to those papers. Which doesn't make any sense. Now, when open access became a big thing and those publishers make eye-watering profits, but when open access became a thing, then instead of the publisher said, well, why don't, instead of writing the papers for free, we're going to charge you to write those papers, to process them, and we'll charge you for having those papers reviewed instead of reviewing for free. And that meant that they didn't, the problem with that is it squeezes out if you don't have research funding, for example, then you've no hope of getting your research published. In the past, at least you could get it published if it passed peer review. Now you have to pay to get that into the game. So it's even more inequitable than it was in the past. And so the world of academic publishing has to change. And it will change to, like we have so much media content now that it's ratings that we use to decide what you watch on television. But truly independent peer review is the key thing. You can't lose that. And that has to be, there are so many open source and open platforms now for Wellcome Research, for Open Research Europe, for F1000 Research, for Peer Community in Review Commons, that will review material independently, and then it can be acknowledged, it can be used. And we have to get on top of that. The old world, as Mark Carney said, I guess the old world isn't going to come back. Those publishers can't operate that model, and the tiny fix of asking people to pay for the research being published is not a solution. So we have to move towards something. And if we could embrace that and get ahead of it as quickly as possible to jump on that mode of research, open research, that's what we have to do.
Thanks, Brian. Josh, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I was thinking along a different set of lines, the answer to your question. I mean, I'm spending a lot of time trying to get my head around what the implications of generative AI are for computational research. Because as has come up, most researchers are not primarily experts in software engineering, in computational work, implementation, et cetera. They are domain experts, and they have had to pick up a lot of those skills to varying degrees. One of the things that's already very clear about generative AI tools in the context of software engineering is that they're especially powerful when you have pre-existing expertise that they're helping to amplify. You know, the developer you're talking about where there's a multiplier on top, that's somebody who already has substantial experience. If anything, we're seeing sort of interesting pressures around like, are, you know, students right out of college getting hired in those kinds of roles? Or is it that, you know, existing staff are that much more effective? So anyhow, I think there's a real question, there's a pedagogical question about what does it mean to be trained in a computational discipline? How much of those skills do you have to pick up? And there's a particular risk, I think, if one of the chronic issues in research code is like someone writes spaghetti code just to get a result, they get the result and then they drop it and forget about it from there. If you don't have a deep understanding of the what that code is doing, to be able to have the discernment to know, does this ring true? Is this slop something else? That's a real risk to the research enterprise at the same time as there's tremendous potential of democratizing technical ability. So there's this tension, and I think we're at a moment of not really knowing how to resolve that yet.
Thank you, Josh. Aedin, Angela? I think you can leave it on.
I think that the whole AI slop is a real concern. You know, if we look, most of the AI algorithms train across the entire of GitHub, but like we know from multiple publications that a lot of that code isn't reusable or reproducible. That, you know, a lot of times you try to bring down that Jupyter notebook and it won't even, like, you cannot even, you know, it won't even work. There's a lot of work on it that actually needs to get it up and running. And so if that's the basis for a lot of this, you know, you have to have that expert view on that of like, okay, that's slop, I'm not including that, this is good. But I think there's another problem which we may encounter, which is scarcity. So we see fewer posts on Stack Overflow because people will go into their chat bot and say, how do I do this now? And so that community is actually fragmenting. So the people that would have been answering those calls, that would have been building that community, you know, I think we need to lean into the people that can answer those questions as well, and actually like use the AI, but don't actually risk fragmentation of the community and the experts, because you know, there is things like Stack Overflow have been so essential, and support forums and things like that. And when, you know, all the students, you know, just chatbot it, we could have a risk there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Aedin. Angela?
So I think I want to take it in a different direction. Obviously, this is a conversation that we could have all day for 3 days, and we probably would still have things we wanted to say. But Saeed points something out in his conversation where he says, we're looking at models and we're seeing that small models are emerging. And I think LLMs, big LLMs, are having a very sexy moment right now. It's like hot to be a big LLM. But if we think about research, research doesn't happen in that space. Research happens in very much smaller spaces typically. And there's more than just LLMs, right? There's recommendation system, there's visual recognition systems, there's classification systems. And these are all considered AI. So if we think about open and AI, I think what we have to think about is empowering and enabling researchers to understand understand what in those smaller models has to be open, and what do we sort of classify, report, how do we make this reproducible and open? I think we have to start with that very basic question with small models first. And as someone who studied a lot of open data, I would say if we want AI to perpetuate in an ethical and responsible way, in addition to understanding how we make small models open, we must discuss how we deal with data that is private or assumed to be private when it is put outside our houses. I don't think anyone expected every Facebook post they ever made to be public and put in an AI bot. I think we need to have real, I have a 9-year-old son. He has a little friend who got a phone. She came into our house and just started filming because she could. And then she wanted to like send that to like a group chat on like just a chatting thing. And I was like, you don't know what's going to happen to that data, right? So I was, we had to have a conversation, but that going back to that, like how do you even deal with data in this space? And what do we think about as researchers as responsible data? Because we're notoriously bad at it and notoriously like held to like IRB standards. So I think those two things in this space.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to now open it up to the floor. So if folks have a question, and we have one over here. Actually, hold on, I'm going to come to you. There we go, Martina. If you can introduce yourself as well.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Claire. Martina Prendergast. I'm the International Funding Manager at Lero as National Software Centre. And I was delighted to hear Angela speak about reproducibility and the importance of it in the OSS world. And I just wanted to announce free plug, Claire, that last week we actually launched the Irish Reproducibility Network for Open Science. And what I'd really like is a call out to anybody in the room who wants to join us. We are mainly focused on open science, but as I've learned over the last few years, the open science community has so much to learn from the OSS community because you established earlier and you've been through all this, and listening over the last few days, your community of practice ideas, what we want to do in the next 12 to 18 months is set up a community of practice for open science for Ireland. We joined the global reproducibility network, and we had some experts last week talk to us about how open science can contribute to open culture, and a lot of what's in that's openly available on the Irish Reproducibility Network website. It was a fascinating discussion, and a lot of what was talked about was underpinned in a number of the questions. So please come and talk to me if you want to join our reproducibility network. Thank you.
Anyone else have a question? And one over here, just thank you. Thank you, Saeed.
I'm so sorry. It's not a question, but a comment. I hope that's okay for you.
No, we're here to learn too. So please, but if you can introduce yourself.
Of course. My name is Sheref Arkan. I am the CTO of Ocean Health Systems. And I also had the privilege of, doing my PhD at UCL. And everything you said about, the balance between trying to have the systems working and researchers trying to focus on what they're doing sounds really just very familiar. But something you mentioned, I think, is extremely critical about the effects of LLMs everywhere. Now, I can say that as someone who's in charge of everything technical in a software company, I'm doing my very best to turn these things into machines of disseminating tested knowledge that I never had the chance to disseminate to juniors. I have to say this because it's sorry for the choice of words, but it's incredibly stupid to not to consider the fact that the seniors, and I'm in that category, who are, so much in demand right now. Here's the problem: we will die, right? And you have a lot of young people graduating, just like I did back in the day, who want to start a life doing what they love. And I think the only way to, just turn the trend on its head a little bit with LLMs is to start using them to empower juniors not by giving them really, complicated tasks, which they cannot do with LLMs because they lack the experience, but using the LLMs to skill them up, to give them so in order to do that, I've been programming the LLMs, the agents themselves, so that they do the nudging I don't have the time to do with the junior saying that, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. So there is almost like a cultural customization path for all the LLMs, small or big. And I think if that becomes a practice in institutions, in universities, in software companies, that could really be a lot more productive going forward. But it depends on people such as yourselves and myself, recognizing that responsibility and planning for it and taking action about it. So yeah, I couldn't resist the temptation to say that.
Thank you. And it was a great point, and I'm really glad that you brought it up, because we just have to continually remind ourselves that it's not always bad, in terms of the AI impact, and there's a potential for us to figure out how to use them better. And we in the previous panel in the skills room, we were just talking about the fact that there's nowhere to actually share these best practices, like these kind of, how are we doing it best practices. I mean, we're finding it hard enough to figure out what models are good there and what's going on at the actual, what's available, but how are we using them, in what context, and how can we use them for good? And there was a conversation yesterday, sorry, I'm going on now, but the conversation yesterday was about how do you do the social thing around that? And there was conversations about, maybe that's the answer to making it better. Loads to learn. So thank you for the comment. Did anyone else want to comment in on that?
I think LLMs are a great opportunity, particularly within organizations, for us to be able to find each other, and for it to be able to, sometimes it can be really difficult to navigate across an organization, and as organizations grow, just to even know where the expertise is or what people are doing. And they're very, very good at parsing that data out and providing it in a readable way.
Thank you, Aedin. Josh?
Yeah, just to add, the point that you make is one I've been thinking a lot about. The way I think about it is, and I'll make a presumption looking at the room, that collectively we are the only generation of people who will have amassed up through, say, mid-late career body of knowledge, and then navigate the world where these tools are emerging. And if we shape the norms of what we expect them to be good for, how we use them for ourselves, then we're eating our seed corn and not figuring out what comes after. And I'll just draw it back to the point that I think one of the best ways to figure out how to do that more effectively is not to simply take these tools and individually, those of us who are in that position, applying them for ourselves, but to create these sort of open communities, these communities where knowledge can move across boundaries. And I think the research context is a really good one to model that in.
Thank you, Josh. And we're coming up to time now, but I want to add +1 to that, because back to this whole idea of communities of practice and the idea that we can all learn from each other. Someone else mentioned in an earlier panel about the power of the loose ties as well. And I suppose one of the opportunities we have is not just to create communities of practice that are domain specific and can work on this stuff, but also to create the loose ties to other folks that have experience and everything to bring it in. So it's a job of work for all of us, but exciting times ahead. And I want to thank all our panelists. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Aedin. Thank you, Angela.